Hey, how you doing today? My name is Nicholas Turner, and I'll be presenting about assessments. So I'll be talking about different assessments for different plans in the classroom. So before I start today, I came up with my little quote when it comes to assessments. I said, "A great teacher is one who is a great assessor." So in my eyes as an educator, the purpose of assessments, whether that's formative, summative, is you want to know how to assess your students. So if you have a rubric, that is a good way to assess your students and to give your students a good benchmark. So a great teacher is one who's a great assessor. If you don't have a rubric or you don't assess your students, how will you know the progression? How will you know your students are learning or not learning? So as a teacher, as an educator, you want to be uh, mindful of having a different assessments. So with that being said, there's two assessments that I would like to talk about today. And then as we go further, I have made different examples of these assessments. The first assessment that I want to talk about is formative assessment. A formative assessment is just simply monitoring a student learning to provide an ongoing feedback that can be used in instruction to improve their learning and by students to improve the students' learning. So all a formative assessment is to see the progression of the student. So from the first day of class to the middle of the school year and then to the end of the school year, you're able to see, has this student been learning throughout the progression of the class, or have they not been learning and have their learning just been stopped or put to a halt. So that's the first assessment I want to talk about. But the second assessment is very important as well. It's the summative assessment. The summative assessment is simply to evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against standard or the benchmark. So a summative assessment will be at the end of a unit. So if I taught 7 lessons, at the end of those 7 lessons, I want to have a summative assessment to see what my students have learned throughout the course of those 7 lessons. So a summative assessment would be like a standardized test or an end of the unit test, but it gives me an idea of what did my students learn throughout the period of 5 to 7 weeks, if that's the case. So those are 2 important assessments that I want to talk about today. So I decided to do my own formative assessment, and this is just an example. So for math, we're talking about early number in number sense. So addition and subtraction within 20. So this is for like elementary math, learning early numbers, and then making sense of numbers. So my standard for this formative assessment would just be I can reason academically and measurably. So for example, the question is, which word best describes the word quantity? So I want my students to tell me or to show me which word would best describe quantity. And I've already taught a lesson about early numbers and then number sense. So my students already should know and have a good idea of what quantity means based off my lesson. So a formative assessment is just a test or it could be an exit slip just for me to know where my students are at after I'm done teaching the lesson. So this is an example of a formative assessment question. Another example would be this: what does the term number sense mean? So again, just giving a clear question about number sense, and it's kind of like a definition question, like what does number sense mean? And like I said previously, I've already taught a lesson about number sense. I already taught a lesson about early numbers. So now my students should know what number sense mean. And this test comes right after the lesson I just taught. So these are a few more example questions. These are longer questions. So example, if Jacob went trick-or-treating with an empty bag, then he went to 3 houses and received 5 gummy bears from each house, how many gummy bears did Jacob receive in total? So now this question is a little bit more broad, it's a little bit more critical, but we're still dealing with numbers and we're still dealing with number sense. And I just want my students to be able to think critically while using number sense and while using early numbers. and then the same at the bottom, but this one's a little different because it's not multiple choice. It's writing the problem out and solving it. So for example, the question is, Andy went over his family's house for Thanksgiving dinner. Andy was very hungry and decided to eat 4 slices of turkey, 2 slices of ham, 3 pieces of cornbread, 4 deviled eggs, one side of mac and cheese, and 2 pieces of peach cobbler. How many pieces of food did Andy eat in total for Thanksgiving dinner? So this is not just a B, C, D question, but it's more, I have to write it out, I have to critically think while using early numbers. So for summative assessment, just like I said earlier, a summative assessment is at the end of 5 or 6 lessons, at the end of multiple lessons, a unit test. So now my students will know about early numbers and number sense from learning 5 different lessons about number sense. So this would be like the final at the end. So for example, I can look for and express repeated reasoning. That's just one of my objectives for this final. And then also, I decided to put pictures on this final as well, just so the students can be engaged. But this is just a good question. If the airplanes are grouped by 3s, how many groups of airplanes do you have in total? And then I put in parentheses, you can circle the airplanes if you need to. So I gave them a hint. But the lessons prior to this summative assessment, we've already worked on grouping, we already worked on how to draw circles and make groups. So now the students, they have to practically show me how to group these airplanes. And then this question is really similar to the last question. How many red apples are there in the first 2 rows? Again, the students, they have to use the concept of grouping that we worked on earlier in the formative assessment. Now they have to show me in the picture. Then I also decided to use the number sense definition, but then I switched it to a true and false. So on a summative assessment, I wanted to have a range of questions. So on a summative assessment, I have a few A, B, C, D questions. I have a few write it out and solve it, but I also have a few true and false questions as well. So just to get the students thinking. So for example, number sense. Do all numbers have to be in order to make sense? True or false? So this kind of is a gimme question. If they study and listen through the other lessons, they should be able to know this. But I think true or false questions are good as well, just to have my students thinking critically about what they learn. And then I rephrased this question because I had it on the formative assessment earlier. But the question is, which word best describes the word quantity? Again, they should be familiar with the word quantity. They should be familiar with the question because it's on a formative assessment. So I decided to use a chart. Some teachers don't like using charts on summative assessments, but I wanted to use a chart because I want to expose my students to all different questions so they can be able to think broadly and just be critical thinkers as they think about math in elementary. So this question is just on a chart and it has data as well. So my students are now, they're going to have to analyze a chart. They're going to have to think through this chart, and it's not just going to be an easy step question. But the question is, which fruit is most least? So it uses 2 words. It uses most and it uses least. So now my students are really going to have to think and slow down while also using the chart to help them as well. So I think this is another good end of the unit test, because in previous math lessons we have worked on graphs, we've worked on analyzing data. So now on this test they should be able to tell me how to use a graph properly while giving me the correct answer. So this is something I decided to do at the very end of this multiple choice summative assessment, ORQ. In this ORQ, I divided it up into 3 questions, but they just have to answer 1 question. So in this section of the unit test, students can choose any word problem they want by writing out sentences. They can use sentences and using different math strategies to solve the given word problems properly. And these are just my standards or my objectives for this ORQ. At the end of this summative assessment, at the end of all these multiple choice questions, my students have to choose one of these three questions. So these three questions are just broad word problems, and once again, they get my students thinking. It's not something that my students can look at and they know 2 + 2 is 4, but they really have to slow down. They have to use early numbers. They have to use number sense in order to answer the question properly. And I did this because I want my students to be critical learners and critical thinkers. And one example at the bottom, it says, explain the meaning and difference between early numbers, quantity, and number sense. Also, use each vocabulary word in a mathematical sentence. So once again, my students, they have to know what early numbers mean. My students have to know what quantity means. And my students have to know what number sense means in order to answer this question properly. And then, once they do that, they have to use each vocabulary word in a mathematical sentence. So my students cannot just guess on this question. My students cannot, just try to butcher the question, but they really have to answer this question with these concepts in mind. So as I end my formative assessment and just thinking about my formative assessment, what's the purpose of an ORQ on my formative assessment? So I want my students to know critically and I want my students to know how to think critically and analytically at the end of the unit. So once again, I just don't want my students to know 2 + 2 or 4 + 4, but I want my students to know, what does number sense mean? How do I apply number sense? And then quantity, how do I apply quantity? So I want them to be robust in their vocabulary. But then, at the end of the day, I want my students to be shaped and formed into critical thinkers, which I've been using this word a lot, and then reflective practitioners. So critical thinkers, I want my students to be able to apply what they're learning in the classroom in order for it to make sense in life. And then a reflective practitioner, I want my students to be able to reflect on what they've been learning and then put it into practice, into real life scenarios. So that is my presentation on formative and summative assessment. I hope that it's helpful, and thank you for listening.